Good morning, everyone. Trust everyone had a nice, restful evening and ready now to come together on the Lord's Day to worship Him, thank Him, praise Him for all that He has done for us, that has made our lives meaningful and giving us hope in spite of whatever may happen in the current world around us. This physical planet that will one day be burned up, the Lord tells us, and all the works that are therein. But we will be brought home with our Father. It's just a glorious thought. It's a wonderful reminder to get us through some of the real difficulties that we face here. All right, we're going to bow and have a word of prayer. We'll begin our class here. Please bow with me. Our Father who art in heaven, hallowed, holy, and great is your name. You alone are the God of heaven and earth, the Creator, our Sustainer, and our Redeemer. This is your day, Father, and we are grateful. We are blessed to be able to assemble in your name. We pray, Father, that as we open your word now, help us to have a clearer understanding and a deeper appreciation for all those things that were done to spread the gospel by our brethren so long ago. Through Christ we pray. Amen. Wednesday night we concluded the 19th chapter, this extraordinary episode at Ephesus in the theater. I say it's extraordinary because this isn't the first time that, of course, Paul would face all kinds of opposition from leaders, both religious and political, but nothing like the scale of Ephesus had happened to Paul before. This is the greatest conflict that he has had so far to this point, and to the point that he could not fix it. He hoped he could, as every teacher, preacher, every parent thinks that they can fix a problem. He couldn't. His disciples, his brethren, even some of the officials said, "You better get out of town, Paul." And so as we begin the 20th chapter, that first statement, after the uproar ceased, and we remember the reason it ceased is the magistrate came in and said, "All right, everybody's dismissed." And he got him out of there. That in itself to me is a rather stunning thought. After it ceased, Paul sent for the disciples, and after encouraging them, he said farewell and departed for Macedonia. Now, Paul's theme throughout his life, and we'll see this here as a good example, is not only to preach the gospel and to convert people to Christ after they have been converted, and I would say likely even before. His theme is to encourage. It's okay. It's all right. Yeah, I know there's all kinds of things going on around us that are out of our control, that's unfair, unjust, etc., but he said it's going to be okay. He is the encourager. I wonder how much he learned from Barnabas, the son of consolation. That's another thought. Now, we get to Acts 20, and here's what I want you to think. When you see or hear or start to study Acts 20, think horseshoe. This is the horseshoe. And that's, if you see it here on this map, it starts in Ephesus, goes up to Macedonia, down to Greece and Corinth, and it'll turn right around and come back up over and back to the same place. And the reason why we mention this is that at these places, things are going to happen, and there are going to be people that we'll see here in this chapter that Paul, as we had noted last week, that he purposed in the Spirit. He had a basic plan, but no telling what's going to happen. And here's a good example. He will get down to Corinth. And notice what it says here in verse 2. When he had gone through those regions and had given them, here it comes, much encouragement, he came to Greece. So he goes up to Macedonia, that's Thessalonica, Berea, Philippi, and then down to Greece, that's Athens, Corinth. And when a plot was made against him by the Jews, as he was about to set sail for Syria. Now, he would set sail from Cenchrea. You remember the map of the isthmus? Corinth was on the west side. Cenchrea was on the east side. Corinth was the way to Rome. Cenchrea was the way back to Jerusalem. He's going to get on a ship that was chartered, likely, to Jerusalem. And word gets out that there's a plot against him. And so he decides, at the end of verse 3, to return back through Macedonia. So here's the horseshoe. He was going to sail straight across. But what he does instead is that in this chapter, he will go back through Greece, Macedonia, and he'll set sail from Philippi, come over to Troas, get down to Ephesus, but he will bypass Ephesus, come to Miletus, and from there he will head straight to Jerusalem. And we will see the reasons why he makes these changes along the way. But before we get to that point, I had promised you a class or two ago that when we were considering in chapter 19 and verse 20, pardon me, I lost my place here. Verse 22. It's marked right there in front. In verse 22, when he sent Timothy and Erastus into Macedonia. Now, we know about Timothy, but who is this Erastus? Well, here's what we want to look at here for a moment. That as he goes through these places, he's going to write 2 books. When he gets to Macedonia, he will write the book of 2 Corinthians. And now that was right around 56 A.D. Back here in verse 22 that we just read, in chapter 19, verse 22, when Timothy and Erastus were sent to Macedonia, that was around 55. That would have been early, mid-55. We get down here to chapter 20 and verse 1. Now we have late 56, something like that. So it's a little over a year away. He writes 1 Corinthians in verse 22, and then he writes 2 Corinthians in chapter 20 and verse 1. And then a few months later, when we get down to verse 3 of 20, he will write the book of Romans. Now, why we point this out is not just to see the historical, the chronology of what Paul was doing and where he was when he was writing, is that this Erastus fella is going to come up again. And what I'd like you to do is turn back to the book of Romans and the last chapter of Romans. This will be Romans 16 and verses 21. And then 23. In Romans 16, verse 21, we read, Timothy, my fellow worker, greets you. So do Lucius and Satian and Sosipater, my kinsmen. So Timothy was with Paul when he wrote the Roman letter. And in verse 23, Gaius, who is host to me, and to the whole church greets you. Erastus, the city treasurer, and our brother Quartus greet you. So back in chapter 19 and verse 22, when Paul had sent Timothy and Erastus to Macedonia, had gone up there. When he gets there and he writes the book of Romans, they are with him when they when he's writing the book of Romans there, and he makes this statement about Erastus. He calls him the city treasurer. Now we're just going to take a moment out of our Bible study and follow up a comment that we made earlier, because this is the appropriate time. I said we'd talk about Erastus when we came to him, that in 1929, archaeologists in the city of Corinth were clearing away in front of the Corinthian theater, and they found this stone that was actually a pavement. And what that says is this. I'm going to blow it up a little bit more. It's got the name Erastus. You see I've underlined it in the orange there. Erastus pro idile su pecunia stravit. I'm confident that's not the right way to say that. But this edilate, is a office of the city of the treasurer, and that engraving is translated Erastus in return for his aedileship paved at his own expense. Now, you remember we'd made the comment that in the ancient world, in Asia and Macedonia, that when they would appoint or elect certain officials, treasurers, men who were in charge of the community, the affairs of the community, the states, the buildings, all of the business part. They would choose someone who was, first of all, wealthy, and secondly, they were wealthy from their own intellect. They didn't inherit it. It's that which they used and made and created for themselves. Thirdly, they would serve for a prescribed time, 1 to 2 years, something in that nature. And then when they were finished, after not getting paid, they would not be paid during that whole time. They would have to contribute something to the community. They would either build a building or make an improvement of a canal or something of that nature for the city works. And then they would do that out of their own pocket, so that there was no occasion or opportunity for any kind of corruption, etc. And that was a very effective way to do this. And you think, well, who would want to do that? Well, just stop here for a moment. In our 21st century world, very few people would do that. But remember, we're not in the 21st century world in this study. We're getting back into the first century box. There were plenty of people who were capable, able, talented, and they were wealthy enough that they would gladly do that for their city and for their people. And we don't know for sure, because if you go online, you can do your own research. It's rather interesting. Critics, modern day critics of New Testament Christianity, jump on this and say, no, that's the wrong office. It's another office. But the evidence against it, there's just as much for it to show that these were offices that would coincide with one another. And so when Paul in Romans 16:23 says, Erastus, the city treasurer, greets you, that he's with, there's a real possibility that this man on this stone that is there is the same man as in Romans 16:23. There's certainly enough evidence to show that it deserves some serious consideration to that. Now, I simply point that out because we had mentioned him in a previous class. Who is this Erastus? Here is a possibility of who this Erastus was. But we're not going to base our faith on it, of course, but it is interesting to note, and here is my spin on this. The opponents or enemies of New Testament Christianity in the first century are not unlike the opponents in the 21st century. They will go to great lengths to try to disprove, no, this can't be him, it can't be him. But when they find something that the dots are connecting so strongly, now there may be a little gap there, but it's just as strong today as it was back then. And for Paul, as we had mentioned in our last class, to have men and women of position and repute and of means and of great influence within a community, that just ate the enemies of Christ up. They just couldn't stand it. Because that's giving Christianity credibility. The gospel now, as Paul has always reasoned with the people, reasonable people sat there and thought, that sounds right. Just like back on Mars Hill in Athens, Dionysius, the Areopagite, that makes sense. Let's hear some more about this. And the enemies, those who would reject the message of Paul, just went crazy. Couldn't stand it. So here is Erastus that is with Timothy now, and Paul, he's in Paul's little, I hate Paul's, I want to say Paul's posse, and that's not giving it enough credit here. The entourage that is going with Paul is growing because more and more of these people are wanting to hear and know and learn, and I believe because so that they themselves can go out and learn and then go out and teach, having learned that. But what we're going to read here in verse 4 of chapter 20 is after that he's gone through Macedonia and written 2 Corinthians, and he's come down to Greece. Now he's written Rome, the letter to the church at Rome. Luke is going to list a group of men here in the 4th verse. Notice, Sopater the Berean, son of Pyrrhus, accompanied him. and of the Thessalonians, Aristarchus and Secundus, and Gaius of Derbe, and Timothy, and the Asians, Tychicus and Trophimus. Now, here are these 7 men that are listed here, and one question that may come up, isn't it interesting that Luke lists them according to their native city or to their hometown? Now, this is what I believe to be the reason for that. It doesn't say it in the text, but in the overall context, when we understand what's going on, this is the reason. Paul, in this second journey now, his objective has been not only to spread the gospel, but as we read in the book of the Corinthian letter, both of them, he's collecting money. He's collecting the relief for the saints back in Judea. And this is important for Paul. And I suspect that Paul is accumulating a significant sum of money when he starts going through these cities. And they're wealthy people there, and they want to help and they want to give. Now, I'm going to just stop here for a moment, come out of this, and make a couple of comments about this. Years ago, many years ago, I got an old DVD that's called Peter and Paul. You can probably find it online somewhere. It was under the radar, but it was well produced. Anthony Hopkins played the part of Paul. And I thought, well, it'd be interesting just to see how they dramatized the life of both Peter and Paul. And when they got to that part where Paul and Barnabas in Acts 11, you remember in the 11th chapter of Acts, there was a prophet by the name of Agabus who came to Antioch and said, there's a famine. It's going to be all over the world. And the Christians at Antioch, who were first named Christians at Antioch, come back to that in a minute, they decided, we're going to send some relief down to our brethren in Judea because they're in trouble. And the way this film dramatized it, I never had thought about this before. Paul and Barnabas called the elders together, as the text says. And then when they came into the room, they had a sack, and they said, we have something for you from the brethren in Antioch. And they took it and they just dumped it on a table, and it was gold coins everywhere. The look on the elder's face, can you imagine? And I'd never thought about the dynamic of that moment, how it would have been that this is a free will gift from our brethren in Antioch. Now, I'll tell you why that is doubly important. Because this would have happened in the days of Claudius. It says in our text in Acts 11, the famine would be in the days of Claudius, which is about 46, 47 AD. That's just a little over 10 years after the church had been established on the day of Pentecost. Up until that time, the center of the church, Christianity, it was Jerusalem. Until in Acts 8, you may remember from previous studies, when the persecution began and then it spread everywhere. And what happened between Acts chapter 8 and Acts chapter 11 was that Antioch was growing and growing, not only in the size, in the number of Christians, but it was growing in its influence. Think about that statement that Luke makes. And they were called Christians first at Jerusalem. They were called Christians at Antioch. That strongly argues that Antioch is now becoming a strong center of influence of teaching and preaching the gospel at that time. And then add to that when Agabus shows up to Antioch and says, there's going to be a worldwide famine, the first thing they think of is that our brethren down in Jerusalem, they're going to need help. So let's send it. They haven't asked for it, but we're going to give it. What do you suppose that would have done in the minds of these Jerusalem Christians when they saw the generosity of their Antiochian Christians give this money to them? There likely could have been earlier some friction, maybe some animosity, maybe some good-natured ribbing, maybe not so good-natured ribbing. You know, we're number one, you're number two. And now Antioch is becoming quite the center. Now, here's my spin on this. My thinking is that when that happened, a light bulb lit up in Paul's mind. He goes, whoa, I see the effect this has had, and it's good. It's really good. And now, as the famine has still had lasting effects upon the people in Jerusalem, what I'm trying to do is to get these Jewish Christians to accept their Gentile brethren. What better way could I do that than to get my Gentile brethren to contribute to the relief of the Jewish Christians back in Jerusalem? And I think that's what's going on in Paul's mind. He's thinking, that's why he says at least twice, I've got to get back to Jerusalem. He wanted to be there for the Pentecost. He's not going to make it on this trip because he's going to be sidelined, but he will get there. And when he brings this relief, I think that will be one piece of the puzzle that is going to make this bridge, this connection between Jewish brethren and Gentile brethren get closer. They're going to make this connection when they see that here are our Gentile brethren who are graciously, generously, and voluntarily giving us this money that we may be able to make it through this famine. So this is an important thing, and this, I believe, is what's going on. And these men that are listed are all men that had been designated by the churches in those cities to carry the money. That's why they're connected with that city. So the people in Berea say, we've got money, we'll send it through Sopater. He said, I'll go with them. Like every preacher who has ever been in a situation like that, where a significant amount of funds come from 3 or 4 different places, we need some kind of safeguard. Either come with me, see this, do this, whatever, to make sure everybody knows where it's all going. And it continues that day even in third world countries. Yes, Ed? Right.
He writes to them and he says, thanks be to God for his unspeakable gift, not about the money, but about the bonding together of the fellowship, and the thanksgiving prayers of the people who received it, and the grace that is provided for the people who are giving it. And so I think you're exactly correct, and you get the dynamic of this. But there's another element to that you mentioned that I want to underline, and that is the Holy Spirit in Acts, as well as in the letters when you're careful to read it, really plays down the star power of Peter and Paul a lot of times. And so what he does that is important in leadership, he empowers people.
Yes.
And so Erasmus was a very important guy. Erasmus travels with him, of course, all the way over to Ephesus, and he says, listen, I've got to go, but you guys got to go strengthen these guys. Erasmus, why don't you go with him? Why? Because he's from Greece, and he's important. He's an official. And so he empowers them, sends them back. That's very interesting. And the same with these guys, and then they go with him to Jerusalem. And of course, after 2 Corinthians, we figure once they show up in Jerusalem with all these funds, everybody's going to love Paul. But when we get there, that's not exactly how it plays out. Because people who are opposed to the truth of the gospel, they will make up lies to try to completely distract from the grace of what God is doing when all these people bring that money to Jerusalem.
Right.
And so this is just a terribly important thing for us to realize today. We need to empower one another. We need to not be afraid of rich brethren. It's very easy to be jealous of brethren who have more than you and to forget that they are doing things for the Lord. They love the Lord. And this has been a big friction that I've seen in my lifetime. And of course, there are whole schools of thought on the book of Acts to try to make him into Jesus into a revolutionary who don't want to have rich people, don't want to even admit that Paul was rich, although somebody paid for Paul to go sit at the feet of Gamaliel. He was not a poor guy when he started out. And so this is a terribly important comment that you're making about how God uses all kinds of people, how God lets people empower people and let them have, the Holy Spirit to work through them, and how that we need to really recognize that and use it today.
Did you at home get that? Okay, I hope you got that. Ed's making the point that, yes, that this is the point, and that's how I got my thinking from 2 Corinthians, that it's important that you get this money together. The men that are listed here, it seems to me, they're the ones who are actually carrying the money. This is too much for one man to carry. And that Paul is not wanting, as Ed said, that he is not the hero, he's not the star here. He's the one who's just trying to get everybody to get going here. And everybody play their part so this thing can be fulfilled. And that's what will happen. But they'll get separated, and Paul will send the money with these men as they will go over to Troas. Paul's job is to... let me back this up. I thought that was my microphone. Too many thoughts went through my mind of a motorcycle. Paul's job was not to get money. Paul's job was to get the people to begin to become benevolent and charitable. And these guys would carry the money, but Paul's job was to go encourage. And he'll go back up over this horseshoe by himself. He'll pick up Luke when he gets up to Philippi. But all these men are going to get on the ship. They're going to head over to Troas. And they're the ones that are carrying this. And the people, this Sopater is likely, possibly the Sosipater that Paul mentions in Romans 16:21 that we read a moment ago. Aristarchus was the fellow we just read about that had been dragged into the theater at Ephesus. It's something after him going there. Now he's going to follow Paul. He's thinking, yeah, I'm with you. Let's get out of here. Secundus, don't know really who he is, where he was. Same with Gaius. This is not the Gaius that we read about earlier from Macedonia. This is the Gaius of Derbe. And Timothy is listed as from Derbe, but they were sister cities. Lystra and Derbe were so close together. They were Iconian cities, and so that's why he is listed there. And we know him as Paul's, as he called him, his true son or child in the faith. And those from Asia, these two fellows are interesting. Tychicus plays a role in the letters that Paul wrote to both Ephesus and Colossians. He was the one who would deliver the letters to them. And he is so named in these letters. And then Tychicus would have been sent by Paul to Ephesus. And then later, Tychicus would have been sent by Paul to Titus personally. So there seems to have been kind of a real close fraternity here between Paul, Timothy, Titus, and Tychicus. And what all was going on. Now, Onesimus is going to come in here too in a little bit, but these are the men that Paul has gathered now, and he's going to go, but he can't go because of whatever this plot is in verse 3, that if he sets sail. Here's an interesting thought. I don't know if this is true or not, but that to set sail for Syria, the ship would have had to have been chartered. Because it was a large harbor and ships went out everywhere. But it had to give a specific place. That means he's going to go all the way back to Antioch of Syria. And he would actually not make it. So he starts walking, and they'll take another ship later on from Miletus. But again, his plans are made, then they're changed. They're made and changed, made and changed. But the main objective, get this collection to the brethren at Jerusalem. So, verse 5, these went on ahead and were waiting for us at Troas. But we sailed away from Philippi. And that's where we get the clue that earlier, when Paul was in Philippi, he left Luke at Philippi and then went on down to Macedonia and Achaia, etc. But here now he comes back through, and now Luke says we. He's with Paul. So Paul and Luke sailed from Philippi after the days of the unleavened bread, and in 5 days we came to them at Troas, and where we stayed for 7 days. You may remember when we first started this class on the second trip starting from Troas to Philippi, it just took 2 days. They stopped at Samothrace, and then next day they were in Neapolis. It just took days. The winds were with them. Coming back, same route, takes 5 days. So the winds were against them at this place. Yes, Brent? Right.
And it's very interesting to see that the way Paul's life is unfolded is that, when he was first called, he did talk to the Jews. And the Jews were given the chance that they didn't take when Jesus was there, and that was to spread the new good news that God would bring salvation to everyone. And then, of course, Paul failed as well in that effort for the most part. And so then it went to the Gentiles. Now the Gentiles are the ones that are coming up bigger than what the Jews did, and especially bringing this gift. And so,
I think you're absolutely right. Brent's making the point that at this time there were likely still lots of Jews in Jerusalem that were thinking they were God's chosen people. That's the heritage they were born with. And that as it transitions over to the gospel, they still may have those kinds of feelings of superiority or such like that. And that this contribution that Paul is collecting would be a great way to get them away from that and get them to start thinking. They had plenty of chances, as you said, with Jesus, then with Peter, and then with Paul. I just think of the Lord's words, "Oh, Jerusalem, Jerusalem, how often I wanted to gather you as a hen gathers her chicks under her wings, but you were not willing." That is a powerful sermon. And that's what you were saying, Brent, and that's exactly correct. And so that's why he's trying to get this thing together, because this will really help get these Jewish Christians over a pretty big hump as they're making their way through their Christian life. And then the Lord will put an exclamation point on it with the destruction of Jerusalem, and then it'll be gone. All right, we need to hasten on here. In verse 7, here's where now they get to Troas, and Paul is going to be preaching. On the first day of the week, when we had gathered together to break bread, Paul talked with them, intending to depart on the next day. He prolonged his speech until midnight. We have to make this point as we cover this verse here. Previous verse, they stayed there 7 days. Why did they stay 7 days? The reason is fairly clear, is that they want to be there on the first day of the week. Because on the first day of the week is when they came to break bread. In spite of what modern day critics would say, no, it was just a potluck. They just got together and they had food. And that was the day of the week that they liked to get together and have all things common, from Acts 2:44. That's just not true. They have come together specifically for that reason. And if I may take 30 seconds to preach this sermon that needs to be preached for those who may be new in the faith, we come back to 1 Corinthians chapter 16 again, when Paul will make reference to this collection. You'll notice in 1 Corinthians chapter 16, the first two verses. Verse 1 says, "Now concerning the collection for the saints." That's what we've been talking about. "Now concerning the collection for the saints, as I directed the churches of Galatia, so you also are to do. On the first day of every week." Now here's where the English Standard Version does a good job, because the Greek is katamion, means not just on one, it's every number one. That's how it's literally translated. Upon every number one, you come together to break bread. So it's not just a happenstance or an occasional or somewhat disjointed first day of this first day of next month, first day of the week. Nothing like that. Paul says it specifically here in 1 Corinthians 16 and verse 2. It was upon the first day of every week. And that's why you and I are here right now, because of what Paul wrote in 1 Corinthians 16:2, and for what they did here in Acts 20 and verse 7. So they're on the first day of the week. They've gathered together to break bread. That's the specific purpose. It's to not just to eat. They can eat anywhere. But they've come together to break this bread. Paul talked with them, intending to depart on the next day. He's thinking, now I can't spend a lot of time here. I got to get on my way. So he meant to go the next day. So what does a preacher do when he thinks he only has one shot at a congregation or a gathering of people? He's going to throw everything in the kitchen sink in with it. And so he goes a little overtime. He goes a little bit overtime. He prolonged his speech until midnight. There were many lamps in the upper room where we were gathered, and a young man named Eutychus. This is a young boy. That's what this is. Eutychus, sitting at the window, sank into a deep sleep as Paul talked still longer. We're way past midnight now. And being overcome by sleep, he fell down from the third story and was taken up dead. Preachers who would chide members for falling asleep, I've never done that. That's not right. There's all kinds of things that are going on with people's lives that they may not be able to withstand a sermon past midnight. I don't think I could. This young boy, he needs his sleep. He's fallen out of this window. Paul went down, verse 10, bent over him and taking him in his arms and said, do not be alarmed, for his life is in him. He bent over him and held him and said, it's okay. Picture is kind of like, a medic gets out of the ambulance and listens for the heartbeat and there's still life in him. That's not what he did. I don't know exactly how he knew or whatever was going, because it says he was taken up for dead. They thought he was dead, but he was dead. And Paul said, no, his life is still in him. And the interesting thing is, when he had gone up and had broken bread, now he's eating. Wait a minute, didn't they break bread earlier? No, this is different. When he went up to eat, broke bread and eaten, he conversed with them a long while until daybreak, and so departed. And they took the youth away alive and were not a little comforted. Now, you've heard, I'm sure like me, lots of jokes about this and how you put this in preachers. And all I would say, if a preacher wants to preach overtime, he better be able to raise the dead. That's what he did. If he can't do that, and then you stay within your allotted time. Here, this is something that Paul is just almost as if it's okay. He's all right. And he doesn't make a big deal about it. To Ed's point, that Paul wasn't the hero. He didn't want the attention. He just realizes that he is the man who has the power or the tools to be able to fix this situation. This is a terrible illustration that I'm going to give you. Just terrible. If you get a flat tire out on the road and there's no one around and there's no jack in the trunk, some guy drives up in a truck and he said, I got a jack and a tire. We can fix that. He's a hero. Why? Because he has the tools to fix your problem. Paul, now in a much greater way spiritually, obviously, Paul's got the tools to fix this problem. But he's not a hero. I just happen to have the tools. God gave me the tools. I fixed the boy. That's why he said, all right, he's alive. I'm going to go eat. It's not an occasion for a big fanfare to have a Paul fest, a love fest for Paul. No, this is it. He said, now I got to get on. He is driven to get here to Jerusalem, and the people are not a little comforted. I mean, they're excited about it. This is wonderful. And Paul says, thank you. I appreciate your good. Thanks for the food. We're on our way. Let's go, guys. And what happens here, which is really interesting to me, is that in verse 13, but going ahead to the ship, we set sail for Assos, intending to take Paul aboard there, for so he had arranged, intending for himself to go by land. Now, if you look at a map of Troas, Troas is it was a harbor at one time. Now it's just kind of a deserted beach with ruins on it and a little road that goes up to where the marketplace was. And the wind is blowing all that, and it's just and it's a nice place, but there's nothing special about Troas at all. And you have to go around this little point here to get to Assos. But when you get to Assos, this place is beautiful. We spent the night there, and I thought, I could spend a week here. The water is so blue and warm and gorgeous, and the coastline as it comes down, you feel like this is just a slice of heaven. But to get there, you had to walk overland here. You see it's 19 and a half miles. It was 60 nautical miles to get around there. Why would Paul say, you guys get on the ship and you go on, I'm going to walk? He had planned that, Luke said. Here's what's going on from a preacher's standpoint, a minister's standpoint, is that so much has happened since Ephesus. I mean, he's gone through an emotional hurricane with Ephesus. And then he's hurried away from there. He gets on his way. They're going to stop him at Cenchrea. He's not going to be able to get on the ship. So he goes back up through Macedonia. He didn't plan to do that, but he says, you guys get on the ship, go. And on his own, as he travels, and you can all travel faster, quicker, easier by yourself. We all know that. Or most of us know that. And it's harder with an entourage. With more and more people, it's hard. And when Paul gets to Troas, he's thinking, I need some alone time. And so he cuts over there. Now, this is one of the things that's, at least to Dewey and I, it was very interesting, is that they discovered that road there a few years ago. And the road from Troas to Assos is this Roman road right here. It had been covered with dirt, but a few years ago, locals have been going up and down. They didn't know what it was because the building at one end, and they just started clearing it out and said, this is the road. And pardon my photography, I'm not anywhere close to that, and this was very dark because it was getting close to the end of the day, but this is the best I could do. But I wanted to point out two things here. You'll notice in this picture, there's a high road, there's a low road right there. About every couple hundred yards, the road would split. Sometimes we were single lane, then go to divided highway, and then come back. The reason for that was for oncoming traffic. Carts that were going in both ways. So there was an occasion on the road there where traffic could bypass each other and then would come back to this single road. And as it goes on down over here, that peak, that's Assos right there. That's where they're heading. And just over that peak is the beach and is the city of Assos. And that's where they were heading. And Paul just needs some alone time to think. Just to think. Ed?
It's also interesting that he says in this context he wants to get to Jerusalem by Pentecost. If you start backing up the days, what you realize is this is an interesting time period in the year. Because it would be at or around Passover and afterward. And so everybody who's a Christian, especially Paul, part of your mind at that time is going, this is about the time of year when Jesus was crucified, raised from the dead, and the church was formed. And so that he needs the downtime, but it's also interesting that it might have been that also was something he wanted to reflect on.
I think exactly that Paul is wanting to get to Jerusalem for the Pentecost so that the Christians could all be there. And this would be a significant, very poignant moment in the history of the church for all of these people to be gathered there at that point, and the Jews particularly, when they could be there when Paul says, oh, by the way, I have a gift from your brethren in Macedonia and Achaia and Asia. And here it is. And there 7 guys walk in with bags of money. Think about what that would be like for these people. What? What's this? These are your brethren who love you and are concerned for you. This is what they have for you. What a great time that would be. And I think Ed's right, that this would have been one of the driving forces for Paul, thinking, I got to get there in time. It's not going to happen, but he will get there and still be able to deliver it, and wonderful things will happen to them as they continue here. But finishing up here, he said in verse 13, but going ahead to the ship, we set sail for Assos, intending to take Paul aboard there, for so he had arranged, intending himself to go by land. So our plan was to go around the corner, then pick Paul up at Assos, and then we'll head on our way to Mytilene. And they're going to go through a series of Greek islands. And the reason for this is fairly simple, is that this is not open sea. If storms come up, they have plenty of safe harbors to get to. This isn't like Paul when he's going to set out from Cyprus and head out an open sea to Rome and then get shipwrecked. This is a much safer route. And we came, verse 15, sailing from there, we came the following day opposite Chios. The next day we touched at Samos. And the day after that, we went to Miletus. Now, why did he stop at Miletus? I'll tell you Wednesday night, because we're out of time. I'm sorry. Wow, that went. All right, Wednesday night, Lord willing, we'll pick up here in verse 16 at Miletus. Thank you.